Hi, welcome to Beyond Organic Wine. I'm Adam Huss. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe or follow this podcast in whatever app you use to listen. It's free, and it will take you less time than it takes for me to ask you to do this, but it's a huge help to the podcast. Thank you. On March 20th of this year, 2025, that is in about 2 weeks from the time that I'll be publishing this, I will be moderating the 2024 Vintage Salon for Napa Green at the Buena Vista Winery. More than just a recap of the 2024 vintage, the salon will contextualize last year in relation to previous years and discuss ways of adapting our viticultures to enable quality wine production sustainably and ecologically from year to year, despite the increasingly variable and at times extreme weather as the climate changes. The panelists for this year's salon are Michael Fry from Mariah Vineyards in Mendocino, Nicole Bacigalupi from Bacigalupi Vineyards in Sonoma, and Laura Barrett from Cliff Family Winery in Napa. I am excited to learn from this brain trust and compare my own experiences working as a vineyard worker in California in 2024. And if you are interested, it's going to be a great time. You can register at napagreen.org. Now, yesterday we had a special event here at Crenshaw Crew, my home wine garden in Los Angeles. We had about 15 people for an introduction to hybrid wines experience. We ended up tasting 11 different hybrid wines from California, New Mexico, New York, Vermont, and even Wales. In addition to showcasing the diversity of both flavors and styles possible, some of the wines came from no-spray vineyards, or vineyards practicing organic viticulture in places where it would be literally impossible with Vitis vinifera grapes. And in addition to the general buzz that comes from tasting 11 wines, I think everyone came away excited by what is possible, both ecologically and culturally, as wine lets go of its chauvinistic vinifera-based past and moves toward a more diverse and delicious future. I mention all this because I'm also planning a one-day symposium on hybrid wines in California, the rise of hybrids in California, and I'm looking for some help. The one hurdle that I'm trying to overcome is a venue. If you have or know of a venue in or around the San Francisco Bay Area, because so much of California's wine industry is based in that surrounding area, I'm looking for something that holds 50 to 200 people seated that could be donated in exchange for premier sponsorship, partnership, or some other non-rent trade agreement. So if you know of anything like that, if you have something like that that you'd like to use, I think it would be a great branding opportunity. Please let me know. You can email me at connect@organicwinepodcast.com. There are already more hybrids planted in California than most people realize, and more get planted every year. It's a really exciting time to get in at the ground floor, really, of this developing culture and all of the opportunities it presents. So again, please email me at connect@organicwinepodcast.com if you'd like to help, or if you're interested in attending, because I'll add you to the list and sort of start a waiting list to give you priority when we finally settle on the details and get this announced and scheduled. All right. Now, this fun episode is a conversation with Domenico Musumeci, co-owner of Ca'Musu and Wine Pirati, with his wife Elise. They live and farm wine in Michigan, and Mimmo, as he goes by, talks us through their unique approach to viticulture. And I know I use the word unique very often to describe the guests that I have, and that's probably because I look for people doing unique work, people that are doing things that nobody else is doing, that are pushing the limits, that are challenging the status quo, that are changing the way we think and do wine. And these guys are definitely doing that. One of the really special things about their viticulture is that they work with a draft horse named Buster. Now, I am a lover of horses, and I worked as a horseback trail guide in Colorado at one time in my life, and I had the great fortune of getting to know and have a relationship with a horse named Vinegar. Vinegar was named for her personality, I'm pretty sure, especially based on our first few meetings. But over the course of getting to know her over several months, and paying attention to her needs and wants and learning about how I needed to change to be a trustworthy partner and leader for Vinegar, I found her to be one of the sweetest beings I've ever encountered, and it's a relationship that I still look back on with fondness. Mimmo and I talk about some of these considerations that may not be top of mind when we think about working with horses or other animals in our viticultures, but they are individuals just like us. And we also get into some of the really practical and economic calculations to factor in to your plan of farming with horses. Like, do you prefer the smell of horse farts or diesel exhaust? That can make a big difference whether you choose a horse or a tractor. And what does it mean to be a good leader? I mean, this is something you might have to grapple with if you choose to farm with horses. In relation to this, Mimmo observes at one point how much we ask of the land, the animals, the plants that we work with and live from, but how seldom do we ask what we need to give of ourselves in return? Mimmo asks us to consider our viticulture as a multidirectional exchange rather than a one-way sense of expectation and even entitlement. We even talk at one point about a kind of vite maritata that they're doing there at Ca'Musu, or married vine viticulture. They started as a way to work with an ecological legacy that they found on part of their land. The way that Mimmo and Elise farm is not common, and it allows us to get some incredible insights from their perspectives on their relationship to their land. We pack a lot into this conversation, so much that I think we may need a part 2 because there is so much more to explore. Enjoy. Mimmo, welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Ciao, Adam. Thank you very much for inviting me
Ciao.
to talk with you about farming grapes and making wine, which are two of my passions. And thank you for encouraging other conversations just like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you said ciao, so I don't want people to think that we're in Italy today, although, there might be a little, something Italian going on here and underneath it all. But where are you? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where you're doing this farming and winemaking. Give us
Yes,
the
so my name
10,000-foot
is
elevation, you know.
not not quite, but my name is Domenico Musumeci. Some people refer to me as Mimmo, and I, along with my sweet, beautiful, and talented wife Elise, own and operate Ca'Musu and Wine Pirati, which are two West Michigan-based wine brands.
West Michigan. So
Correct.
you're what? I think I looked at a map. You're about an hour outside of Grand Rapids. Is that about right?
Yeah, we're about an hour's drive west of Grand Rapids.
Okay, got it. And that's probably the biggest population center near you.
Most definitely.
Okay, got it. What's it like around there? Are you on the lake? Are you how close are you to the lake, to the shore?
We're about 7 miles from Lake Michigan. From what
Okay.
I understand, is when this hill was originally colonized by white folks, because it was, white European settlers that made their way into West Michigan and kind of established the fruit growing area that it is today. But the first thing they found when they got here was a lot of woodlot. So when they cleared the trees on top of our hill, and I mentioned to you earlier that we are the second highest elevation in Oceana County. But when
Wow.
you cleared all the trees from this hilltop, you can see all the way down to Lake Michigan. So although we're 7 miles away from our vantage point, you can see the big lake if we were to clear some of these trees. But you'll find when you visit, Adam, and I hope you do visit someday, that we like to keep a lot of the trees on this property. And there's a reason for that. And I'm sure we'll get into it more as we touch upon our perspective on farming.
Yeah, more trees, more trees. This is my
More everything.
philosophy, right? Yeah, exactly.
Biodiversity, right? Nature
Yeah,
tells us that there is strength and resilience in diversity, and we certainly embrace that to the best of our ability here.
love that. Well, when you go to your about page on your website, which is
Hmm.
camusu.com, I'll just throw it out for
Correct.
you now. Um, Not only is there a picture of each of you and Elise, but the non-human characters who are participants on your farm, especially, I just I've now realized I need a headshot for my cat on my website, on the winery website. Well,
If your
but
cat is photogenic, then yes, by all means.
I mean, aren't all cats photogenic? Come on.
I think any
um,
cat lover would say that, yeah, probably.
Well, it looks like you have a lover and a fighter in your two cats. One who's pretty serious, pretty intense, and the other one who's kind of like playful. And is that a fair assessment of those two
They're
personalities?
both lovers, they're both fighters, they're just at
Okay.
different ends of their journey. So
Got it.
basketball cat is we affectionately refer to her as our golden girl. So she is over 20 years old.
Oh my God.
How much over 20, we're not quite sure, but we know that she is at least 20. She's probably closer to 21 or 22 years old, but she could be even older than that. And seeing as she is at the tail end of her journey, although we do always joke that she's going to outlive all of us, she is definitely more docile at this point in her life. But don't get it twisted.
Right, right.
She still has a little bit of that spark which comes out from time to time. Now, Wee
Good.
Mams is our younger feline, and yeah, she is definitely a lover. There's no doubt about that. But
Okay.
she is, and I don't know if I can curse on this podcast, but she is a badass cat. And
Oh
she
yeah,
definitely
you can.
performs a lot of the more traditional cat roles around the farm, such as finding critters and uh, dealing with them to the best of her skill set because as I'm sure you are aware, nature can find a way to do a better job than a human ever could. And we really tried to embrace that as much as we possibly can on this farm because it's just Elise, myself, these farm animals. There's no one else here who's assisting us with this project outside of, say, maybe a little help from family or friends when we're planting grapevines or during harvest season we may have someone who's interested in climbing into a bin of grapes and crushing them with their feet, for the
Yeah.
experience. But apart from that, it's two humans and a little farm family that are making this project work. And so, if you're going to limit yourself to those kinds of resources, then you need to understand that Mother Nature is a valuable partner and one to lean into and not one to fight against.
So there's several other characters here on your about page. So I mean
Mm-hmm.
characters, members of your farm family. They just that you've taken pictures that they have big personalities, all of them. So it's that's the kind of character I'm talking about. But before we jump into that, tell us a little bit about the farm. Like, what's the makeup? You're growing
Sure.
grapevines, right? You're making wine from grapes, and so yeah. Can you talk about like how much land do you have and how much of it's dedicated to what and that kind of thing? And how are
Yeah.
you, yeah,
So
that kind of stuff.
we'll kind of discuss
What's
the
your
where we
philosophy of all
farm,
that?
what we farm, because where we farm and what we farm are relatively short conversations, and then how we farm we can get into as much as you have time for. So the two
Right.
wine brands that we represent, there's Ca'Musu, where we make the short story of that is where we make wine from fruit grown on this farm, and that's the brand Ca'Musu. And then our second brand is Wine Pirati. Wine Pirati, we make wine from fruit grown off of this farm, but we try to source it as close to home as possible.
Okay.
Okay, so
Got it.
when we talk about Ca'Musu, Ca'Musu is defined by this hill where we farm and how we farm it. All
And
right,
it's like, so
so
that's a
where we
state.
farm,
Yeah.
this hill where our farm is located is known as Star Hill. Star Hill is a historic site located in Hart, Michigan. As we said, that's West Michigan. It's about an hour's drive west of Grand Rapids. We really liked this property because it already had a human footprint. All right. So this was
Yeah.
originally a small family owned farm. It was diversified. They farmed with animals, and this existed for multiple generations. Right. The farm also had a history of grape production. So both commercial
Ah,
and wild. And those are
oh,
both great indicators of potential site selection.
I
When you talk
agree.
about viticulture in Michigan, historically, viticulture in Michigan was recognized in the southwestern part of the state. And then as you move up the western side of the state, you started to see different types of fruit crops. And although this area was maybe more recognized for tart cherries or peaches or apples, and Oceana County was actually the asparagus capital of the world because in all of the low sandy spots, they're
Oh yeah.
completely covered with asparagus. Uh, on this farm, because of the diversity of crops, they were growing grapes as part of the family farming operation. In fact, I'm looking out one of my windows right now and I can still see an old row of grapevines that still exist after all these years. But when
Oh
you
wow.
walk this hill, there are plenty of ancient wild grapevines. And so the
Yeah.
fact that there was both a not necessarily grapevines grown for wine production, but there was both commercially farmed grapes here and wild grapevines existing on this farm to us suggested that we can maybe plant some grapevines here and have some degree of success. Now, it might not be as successful as we want it to be or as we dreamed it could be, but there were some indicators that we could do worse than maybe put some grapevines in the ground and see what comes of it. Now, another thing that really attracted us to this site is that this farm had not been actively managed for roughly 50 years. So that was important for us because it allowed the property to recover from continuous agriculture. And as much as I appreciate the endeavor that is regenerative farming, and this is just my opinion is that if you truly want land to recuperate, you have to put it in the hands of Mother Nature. And as the human, you need to step back and allow that process to unfold. And it's a slow process, understandably, but the reward from allowing nature to do the work can be pretty impressive. And I'll give you an example. We have mushrooms that grow on our farm 365 days a year. So right now, although it's snowing outside, we have probably 2 feet of snow on the ground. You can go out to certain parts of the farm and dig away that snow and find mushrooms popping up out of the ground. And that to us told us that there's a sign of life in this soil. And had this property continued to have been farmed prior to us purchasing it, I don't know if we would have been able to make that kind of discovery.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have a couple things to say if you don't mind me
Mm-hmm.
jumping in here,
No,
but
please.
I think I really agree, and I don't know how, I don't know if people realize how important of an insight it is to say, I'm going to look at the land and see if there are vines already growing, and that is a great indication of a place to grow grapevines because
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
so many places on the planet where people have built massive wine grape industries in places where grapes have never grown until they planted vinifera there. And I just think it's, look, there's something to be said for it's already happening. So maybe that's a good place for it. And it's not happening. So maybe don't force something there. I could be wrong. I mean, look, there's a lot of factors that go into that, but I think I love the thought process that says
Sure.
this is happening here, without me doing it. And, and so if I do it, that might mean I have a leg up. I have the assistance of the whole ecosystem working to make this happen because it clearly is happening without me. Having said that, like some of what you're, and this is just, a difference of opinion perhaps, but
Mm-hmm.
I, and maybe you're right. I mean, I think what I took away from what you said was I think time is like a really important factor in healing of any kind,
Oh
but
yes, yes. When
specifically
you think
land.
about
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
yeah, when you think about the most fertile places on the planet, they were not created by humans. They were created by nature over a very long period of time.
Well, so
And I think that that's
that's
one
where we.
example.
Well, so that might not. I'm going to push back on that because what we're
Yeah.
finding is some of the more fertile places, like the Midwest, was soil developed in concert with human influence. People who were helping to move bison around, people who were burning to keep the bison grounds available, and then the constant like burning, bison grazing, things like that. It was not just like it wasn't the absence of humans. I don't know that there's a place on Earth, and this is kind of what I was getting at. I'm as much as I am a fan of like why the rewilding movement started, and I'm not saying that's what you're suggesting the rewilding movement, but there's elements to it that are similar, and it's this idea that like if we pull humans out, like that is a beneficial thing. And to me, I think it's just another way to keep us separate from this thing that we are intrinsically a part of and have always been a part of. And so I'm like really I'm against the rewilding movement right now. I'm like, I don't think there is a place on earth that hasn't had human imprint. There's different kinds of human imprint. Now, what
Correct.
what I would say
Correct.
is like yes, having European agricultural ideas influence a land, it's great to take a break from that. But there are lots of different ways that you can work with a land, and influence it and help it, that I don't think have to be rooted in a European idea of separation and plowing and extraction, which I think we do all need a break from. I think the whole world needs a break from that right now. But there are other ways
I
that
could
I think
not agree with you
humans,
more.
but I think there are other ways that humans, not necessarily human, although Europeans, prior, it's more like I don't want to just blame Europeans, because the reality is, we were all indigenous at some point somewhere, and we
Yes.
had to figure out how to live in concert with our land. We were part of that land. I mean, we didn't have to figure out how to. We like evolved with the land. We evolved with the plants and animals of that land. We were one of them, and we didn't have to think about this idea of being separate and how do we integrate ourselves with it. It's like we already were integrated. We were just like naturally part of it, and we all were that at one point. And we all created food and tended the ecosystems as a way to be able to survive with everybody else there. And I think it's more this idea where I don't know where it began. Like it's a really interesting question to me, but it's like this idea of extraction, this idea of like using up something and having our populations exceed the carrying capacity for a land, and not seeing limits to our growth, not seeing limits to our accumulation of material wealth, and wanting to that the land naturally put on us. And just like instead we were just like, we're going to use up all the resources of this place, and when it's used up, it will just be spent, and we'll just move on and extract from another place and mine another ecosystem until it's spent. And I don't know when that began and what the ideas behind that were, but it's I don't want to just blame it on Europeans who also once were, but it did come from Europe. I think, in the colonial era, that's where it came from. But I mean, at some point, something changed in the thinking that led us to. I mean, look, I like what I'm avoiding saying is capitalistic extraction. It's that capitalist colonialism, is what I think the led us abroad. It was that idea, those ideas that led to that idea that you're talking about, that we need a break from. So anyway, there you go. That's
Well,
my
Adam,
pushback.
if you don't mind me saying, let me take a little bit of what you said and tie this into what we are doing here. So you had talked about grazing of animals and controlled burns. These are two things that happen in nature, right? So
Yes, right.
these were humans applying phenomenon that happen in nature to the benefit of the management of their farms. And so this is, I don't want to jump what we farm and start getting into how we farm, because I think we've well discussed where we farm.
Right.
But this idea of, as a farmer, being as limited in your participation as necessary, but when you do participate, trying to emulate nature as much as possible, you'll find that there's a lot of reward that can come from those practices. And so I would agree with you that humans can have a role in the healthy stewardship of land, but at least in my opinion, I think that comes from engaging in practices that reflect what nature already does.
Mm.
So, but before we get too deep down that path, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
would
yeah.
like to
No, no,
touch
please.
very briefly
No,
upon
no,
what we farm, and then we can get into
please.
how we farming, and we can continue down this rabbit hole. So, what we farm. So, we currently have 7 acres under vine. All right.
Got it.
Roughly 90% of those grapes are resistant varieties. And we
Cool.
have approximately 31 different varieties planted. That does not include clonal variations.
Right.
right? And so those are PV varieties, North American hybrids, native grapes, and some vinifera.
Fantastic. What a great diversity. It sounds like you could be breeding grapes there, whether you mean to or not, just with all that difference of pollen floating around. You might have some
I'm a
fun
firm
things happening.
believer, Adam, that we should all be growing things like Gouet Blanc and some, Riparia and all of these other things. And, develop, if
Yeah.
you're growing grapes, propagating by seed, and this may not be something that will ever come to fruition in your lifetime or my lifetime, but, if as quick and efficient as it is to propagate vineyards through cuttings, I think we do see that there is, in fact, not just a drawback, there are several drawbacks to pursuing that path. And that, yeah, if some of us would have taken a little time previously to explore some of these other avenues when it comes to, creating new varieties, there is potentially reward in that. And a great example is one of the local growers that we work with. And this is a small vineyard that's maybe 3 miles up the road. This family has been farming grapevines since the early 80s. And so they have some legitimate old vines for this area. And one of the things that I love is right out front of their doorway to their home is they have this beautiful disease resistant vine that clearly looks like Riparia, but it's got white berries. And this grower thinks that Riparia had somehow hybridized with he thinks potentially Vidal Blanc, but it could have been one of the other white varieties that he grows in his vineyard. And we look forward to not only propagating that from cuttings, but maybe also getting some seeds from that variety and exploring if there's any potential for that variety in this area. And again, it may not come to any type of financial success in our lifetime, but to have a little project that may reap a reward for someone further down the road. We should all be doing a little bit of this if we have the time and the resources to allow us to do so.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. So how do you care for 30 different varieties, some of which are vinifera in that climate?
Oh
To
my goodness. Oh my goodness. So this is a great question. So, and it's quite specific. So if you don't mind, I would suggest let's stick a pin, right, in what we farm, right? Because I think
Okay.
once we start getting very deep into what we farm, it can become quite nuanced. So as we start to discuss how we farm, let's start with maybe some more macro understandings of our practices here, and then we can
Please.
distill that down as we continue along this path. So
Please. Yeah.
let's start with some admissions. In fact, I'll start with 3 admissions when it comes to how we farm. The first, it is important to stress that we are not foraging for a living. All right. We are intentionally farming with the least amount of human input that we deem necessary, which may very well change from vintage to vintage. Okay.
Yeah. Right.
So the second point is Elise and I have qualitative and quantitative goals like every other farmer. However, our end goal is more so defined by doing less work, which I know you will appreciate.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
So, thirdly, we respect that all farms should look different because every piece of property is different and every farmer is different.
Yeah.
Okay. So now that we've admitted those things, it's, I think, equally as important to reveal that at this point in this project, we are far closer to our starting point than our ending point. As far as I know, tomorrow is not promised to anybody, but I would like to think that we have many good years ahead of us where we can
Yes. Yeah.
continue to explore, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm excited to revisit this conversation with you down the road to assess how our relationship with nature and the farm has changed. Because as you know, change is a certain inevitability in life.
Yep.
So, farming, we describe our farming as farming with nature. And we describe it as much because our practices go way beyond organic or biodynamic. And this concept means that we accept that nature does most of the work regardless of our farming practices. But accepting and submitting to this reality generally takes more time to yield results. But we do believe that nature does a better job with little to no human input, because then there is little to no human error. And oftentimes, what we've seen with contemporary farming practices is a lot of these practices are, in effect, just correcting errors that humans either they did that farming season or in previous seasons or previous generations with their footprint on that property. So we really try to accept and submit to nature and then interject ourselves as little as possible. However, when we observe that it is absolutely necessary to be more actively participatory, we attempt to copy what nature would do to the best of our ability and our resources. And so I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that we have a fabulous woodlot on this property. And if you are going to emulate what nature does, that means that you have to maintain unadulterated terrain on your farm, because it is essential for educational purposes in order to better recognize or maybe even understand the behavior of nature. Now,
I'm
I
here.
think I think in so many ways, how light can our farming footprint be, right? And so our farming footprint is kept purposefully small, right? I mentioned earlier, it's only what Elise, myself, Buster, and whatever farm family is encouraged to participate. But we've designed it to be that way. You know, if we were farming 50 acres of grapevines, I don't think Elise and myself and Buster and Basketball Cat and Wee Mavs and the pasta family, you know, the chickens, I don't think we would be able to accommodate that. Certainly not if we designed it like so many other modern vineyards. It would just be an impossibility. We would be not just encouraged, but almost forced to embrace heavy equipment and fossil fuels and things of that nature in order to accommodate a vineyard of that size and responsibility. But because we have kept our operation intentionally small, this allows us to better utilize what we have here on the farm, which means having this space that is kept wild, unmanaged, purposefully for that educational resource. And I think now is a lovely way to transition into some of the foundations of our farming, because we do list on our website 3 farming foundations, because I think in many ways it doesn't discuss everything that we do, but it does give people a good idea of what is important to the success of this farm. And I mentioned Buster earlier. Buster is our Suffolk Punch draft horse. So we do not own a tractor. Buster is our mechanization, for better for worse. And I
That's your
would not
horsepower.
recommend.
Yep.
I would not recommend the original horsepower, exactly. I would not recommend that everybody farm with a horse, but we love it. You know, when we were first introduced to farming, the first technology you're generally introduced to, if you show the capacity, is a tractor. Because unless you grow up on an Amish farm or another plain person's farm, that's generally not a technology that is widely available. And so Elise and I got introduced to tractors. Tractors are cool. You can certainly get a job done with them. But we knew from my history in the wine industry that there was a long past of people farming with either oxen or horses, and that there are still some people today that continue to use that technology. And so we made the effort to educate ourselves on not only how to farm with horses, but also how to farm with oxen. And we just found that horses were a better fit for our personality. And we use Buster for as many things as we possibly can on the farm. But regardless of how you use this animal, there are certain things that come with the territory. you know that farming is a lifestyle, and farming with horses is an extension of that lifestyle. And we wouldn't have it any other way. But we also feel like farts are funny, right? And a
Yeah.
2,000-pound animal has big farts, and big farts are very funny. And I'd rather smell horse farts than tractor exhaust, and I'd rather feed Buster grass and hay than buy diesel. But that's a personal choice. And if someone decides to use a tractor to achieve their farming end goals, I can't begrudge them that, because if you don't like working with a horse, it doesn't matter what other rewards come from that relationship. Uh, if you don't like this tool or this technology, farming is tough on the best of days. And so when things do get challenging, you want to be working with technology that you're comfortable with, because that will help you get the job done.
Yeah, that's I appreciate all that. I mean, that's I mean, I have so many things I want to go back to, but I since you
Sure,
started talking
please.
about bust, no. I think we'll jump ahead. I mean, we can come back, but I think it's really important to talk about Buster. And
Hmm.
I mean, one of the many things that I've learned from working with lots of different animals is like, I I say this because I want to ask you about working with horses. Generally, it's not something we've talked about. I mentioned this to you, and I'd love to dig into some of the details of that from a financial standpoint and a
Hmm.
just the knowledge base thing. And I think there's so many, like you're saying, you're drawing this analogy to tractors, and I think there's so many things like obviously if you're going to run a tractor, like eventually if you're a farmer out in the middle of nowhere, you're going to have to know some mechanical skills or have a good mechanic nearby because things are going to break down. There's maintenance involved.
Yeah,
Horses, there's a lot of analogs to that with caring for horses as well. That there's veterinarian things, but also just like you have to know your tack, you have to manage, all of the reins and harnesses and things that are required to
correct.
make this make your horse able to do the work that you need the horse to do. So it's not just like animal husbandry, but it's there's a level of just knowledge about these things that is required. But it's also, I mean, the other thing that I would say, which is the one difference with tractors where there is no analog, is like every animal is an individual, so there's personality
Oh yeah.
difference in
Oh
in
yeah.
every animal you work with. So if you have two horses, they're not going to be the same. You can't talk about them generally. I mean, you can about some things, but it's sort of like talking about people generally. There's always going to be exceptions, and there's always going to be personality differences and nuances that you'll have to account for that nobody can tell you about. So I just
Yeah.
put that out there as a caveat. I'm sure, yeah, like you said, you agree with that. But
I would
having
agree with it
said,
immensely. And I
go
would
ahead, go
say,
ahead.
as a quick insight, if anyone who listens to this has an interest in farming with animals and specifically draft horses, I recommend, as in so many walks of life, but particularly with this, find a mentor.
Yeah,
Find a mentor, because, as you mentioned, it's not just animal husbandry. It's how do you maintain the equipment? It's a working relationship, and sometimes it's hard enough having a working relationship with another human being. Someone who
right.
is in your area, you speak the same language, right? Maybe you have similar thoughts and ideas, right? Now you're trying to collaborate to get a job done with a different species, right?
Yep, yep,
And we are very fortunate that Buster, we communicate with him not just through the lines, but Buster also speaks English. So we can speak English words, commands to him that he understands. But
great.
we took it upon ourselves to educate ourselves to the extent of how do we speak equine? Because horses have their own language.
Yeah,
So there are people out there, professionals out there, who have made it their career to understand the language of animals, in this case, specifically horses. And so when Elise and I started to inform ourselves on how we speak this language, and we use those language skills with the horses we were working with at that time, it was a mind blowing experience, because we walked
huh.
out into this pasture to communicate equine to the best of our ability, which I'm sure was very poor. As anybody who has learned a foreign language, you make so many mistakes in the beginning, but you have that humility, right? And other
Yeah,
people recognize that you're being humble, you're making an effort, and that goes a long way. And so when we walked out into this pasture and started to address these horses in their own language, afterwards, when Elise and I walked out of that pasture, I kid you not, all these horses got together in a group, all muzzles in a circle, as if they were having a conversation, as if to say, were those people just trying to speak to us in our own language? And I tell you, the working relationship changed immensely after that.
Huh.
And I think that has everything to say about we ask so much sometimes from nature, whether it's plants or animals. What are we asking of ourselves in
Right.
return?
Right.
Right. And so I think this is an
Great question.
important component to keep in mind is like, yeah, find someone who could teach you and instruct you on how to work with these animals, but also just recognize that this is a relationship. And in a relationship, you need to have communication. And as great as it is to be able to communicate with Buster on his level, sometimes it's nice just to go out into the dry lot and just spend some time sharing space. As I'm sure you're aware, you can work with someone day in and day out for years and know very little about them. And then you go out and have a couple beers one night and it like totally changes the dynamic of the relationship. To merely
Yeah.
spend time outside of work, even with Buster, that changes the day to day when there is a job to get done in ways that I would do a very poor job of describing. You really have to experience in order to understand the reward of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. That's great to hear. So with that, with all these sort of things to keep in mind, what are the nuts and bolts in terms of you guys started out, you probably had to buy Buster, you had to buy all the tack and equipment necessary for Buster's maintenance and work ability with the farm. Can you talk through numbers? Can you talk through like if somebody's
Love
really
to. Yeah,
interested in
love
this,
to.
like what can we expect to spend, and then like the annual basis care and stuff like that, like yeah, what are the realities here?
Sure. Realities is horses are expensive, like anything else.
Yeah, yeah.
But you have to put them to use, right? And like any tool, if you are using it, then that in many ways justifies the expense. If you have both draft horses and you have a tractor, and just because it's easy to hop on that tractor and turn it on and off, and that's what you're using to get the job done, and those draft horses are sitting out in the pasture watching you as you drive by on the tractor thinking, I could do that job, right? Now those horses are just expensive lawn ornaments, and we certainly don't have the time or the resources in order to accommodate a passenger. We always say that if you have two legs or if you have four legs, if you're on this farm, you're going to have a job to do, right? So regardless of the expenses, making sure that these animals, in this case Buster, has work to do is paramount to justifying the expense. Now, the reality of it is, although horses are expensive, you don't have to spend $80,000 on a draft horse. I remember one conversation with my mom. My parents live in central Illinois. There's an Amish community just south of them. And my mom said, oh, there was this Amish horse auction and this horse sold for $80,000. And I thought, that horse is not farming. Now they may be using that horse for other things, but no one's spending $80,000 on that horse and then putting it in a harness and putting it to work. So Buster, I assure you, did not cost $80,000. Now you can spend $5,000 on a draft horse, and that would
Uh-huh.
be one that is seasoned, right? So you don't have to break this horse or invest in someone else breaking this horse for you. So they learn exactly what it is to, put on a halter, put on a harness, pull a piece of farm equipment. We were very
Right.
fortunate that when it came to Buster, our horse mentor, Dwayne, who's now 87 years old, and he's not just a mentor, he's a friend, he's family. This may be TMI, but we call Dwayne every Saturday at 8:06 p.m. and we have an hour and a half long conversation about Buster, about the farm, about life. Uh, Dwayne is just a fabulous resource, not just for farming or farming with horses, but he's an exceptional person. We're very thankful to have him in our life. But Buster was originally Dwayne's horse. And so when Dwayne had to give up working with horses on account of age, Buster went down to our mutual Amish friend Alan's farm and spent a little time down there. When we were ready to move Buster up here, Buster moved up here, and we did not have to spend a lot of money to get Buster. We essentially paid Alan what Alan had paid Dwayne in order to have Buster on the farm. So that expense for us, we were fortunate in that regard. We're also very fortunate that Buster is an extremely versatile horse. You talked about this earlier with animals, different personalities. A horse that's good for one person may not be good for another. It may
Yeah.
just be a personality clash. You may find that a horse that is a great working horse, it may not have a personality that jives with the other horses that you may have on your property. So you
Yeah.
team up, a certain pair of horses, and they may not necessarily get along. Buster has an incredibly agreeable personality. He's also exceptionally versatile. So Buster is the only horse we have on the farm currently, but in the past we have worked Buster in a team. So that's two horses. We've worked him in a 3-up, a 4-up. We've worked him with 6 horses, 8 horses, various different configurations. Buster's walked in the furrow. He's walked behind loud and smelly equipment. Buster has done so many things that his versatility for us is invaluable. And that doesn't come with just any animal.
Right.
That's something that in many ways has to be trained. And there are some horses that are just better suited to certain jobs, kind of like there are some humans that are just better suited to certain jobs. And that comes with the territory, right? So someone could say, hey, look, this horse is not expensive, is in great condition, has experience. The whole harness comes with the price of the horse. And you may very well get a test drive of that horse around that person's farm from whom you're going to purchase this animal, and everything is hunky dory. And then you get this horse home, and it's night and day. Like these situations do come up. There are no guarantees in this business, and so clearly experience goes a long way. Having some mentorship is really, really helpful. And also just recognizing that being patient, being humble, putting in the work, and that even with all of these things kept in mind, if it doesn't work out, you have to know when to cut your losses and move that horse on to someone else where there may be a better fit. And then you find either another horse or you find some other kind of technology that's maybe better suited to your conditions.
Yeah, I think we both alluded to this, but the way that I'm thinking of putting it now to make it a little bit clearer is, if you have a lawnmower or a tractor, you don't have to change yourself to operate that. You might have to learn, how to turn it on. You might have to learn the pedals and levers you have to use to operate it properly. But your personality doesn't have to shift. You don't have a learning curve in terms of how to relate to it. Whereas with an animal, you very well may. Like, you might need to actually change part of yourself.
No, not may. You need to. Yeah,
yeah, like you will.
It's not may.
Right. Like, there's a self-awareness about how to treat this creature, this other individual, with its own personality in the exact same way that you would have with any relationship, like a work relationship or any a marriage or any friendship, anything like that. You have to change parts about yourself to accommodate the individuality of that being, and so it's really important to consider.
Look at it this way. Right? Look at it this way. So if you are in a leadership position, and if you are the person who is the teamster is the one driving the animals. If you are driving the horse, you are the teamster. You are in a leadership position. That animal or those animals are looking to you, all right, as the one to make those decisions, because they can't be the one in charge. Because if they're the one in charge, that job is not getting done. Now, don't get me wrong. Buster was bred for this kind of work, so he wants to do it. But if you put him in charge, he'd probably much rather be out in the pasture snacking on grass. And you can't argue with him for that. But if you as the human are going to be put in charge, do you want to rule through fear, or do you want to rule through respect?
Right.
And to be honest with you, in the world of farming with horses, people apply both models. And I can understand why they would do both. For us, it was far more important that these animals respect us.
Right.
Because we think that that ultimately not just provides a better quality of life for the animal, but I think it ultimately allows you to develop that relationship to a deeper extent than you could if it was only a relationship that was based on fear.
Right. I keep thinking of like the Caesar Milan dog training thing where it's like when he comes in to train these dogs, it's not the dog that needs training, it's the owners, right? Like it's
Oh yeah.
and like
Yeah. Yeah.
and like you create the bad habits by your personality and your not knowing how not knowing the psychology of how this animal, what the animal's needs are from you. And I think you bring up a big point of like you are the leader, like you, especially
Yeah.
with horses, it is your job to lead. And for a lot of people, they're, you're not in that position often, like especially if you're just
Yes.
getting started in farming, it's the having a leadership role can be very unfamiliar to you, and so that's something to consider and think about what different skills are needed, what different, like how to be a good leader. Like you're going to have to learn that, because that will be a role that you will have to take to work with these animals.
And I'll tell
So
you what, Adam, if you do not have that skill set, if that is not something you have learned, because Elise and I have taught classes on draft horse basics, one of the first things we tell those students before they get the lines in their hand is fake it till you make it.
yeah.
Because if you are not able to be that leader, you have to at least make that horse believe that you are or can be that leader. Otherwise, it's a slippery slope from there. But eventually, you put that work in, and
Yeah.
it's like with anything, you do have to put those repetitions in. But you'd be surprised, how just faking it in the very beginning very quickly you start to build that confidence and that comfort, and you will feel it, and that animal will feel it as well. Because when you look at the history of species, I mean, humans are what, maybe 5 million years old? Like horses are 50 million years old. So horses are 10 times older than humans. Horses are such a powerful reflection of their owner.
Yeah.
And so, if you really want to get a better understanding of who you are as an individual, work with horses, and they'll let you know very quickly
Yeah.
what kind of person you are. And
Wild.
they've
Yeah.
and horses have this ability because think about how a horse operates in the wild. A horse doesn't want to fight you. In fact, if a horse is going to fight you, it's in a desperate situation. A horse is an animal that wants to flight. It wants to run, right? That's what it was designed for.
Yeah.
So it has a pretty good sense of sight. It has a pretty good sense of smell. It has an amazing sense of hearing. In fact, if you look at horses out in the pasture, their ears are always moving around in different directions, like, little satellites trying to pick up all these little sounds, because they want to know where the danger is coming from so they know to run away.
Yeah, they're like the world's
These
largest prey animal.
Right. But these horses have spent so much time historically observing their surroundings. I mean, they saw humans even before we were humans, right? And they've
Yeah.
seen us make all of this progress. Uh, they have such a deep understanding. It's helpful to tap into that, because this animal is more than just a means of getting a job done. It's truly an extension of relationships on the farm and tying into the natural world. That is just a beautiful thing if you can respect that, if you can appreciate that. If horses are just not your thing, then my goodness, don't waste your time, right? They always said the best thing that happened to horses was the invention of the tractor, because those people that truly loved horses or were maybe constrained to working with horses because that was some type of religious or communal pressure, they had to
Right.
do so. But for all those people that no longer loved working with horses, they could get on and off their tractor. And, maybe that would meant that it's not that everybody that continued to work with horses was more respectful, but certainly there were probably a lot of people that were ready to be done with horses, and that's okay. Just because we do it by no means suggests that everybody should do it or can do it or will enjoy doing it.
Yeah. Well, so I have heard figures for, and I'm just, this is, I love all the stuff that we've gotten into. I
Yeah.
didn't expect this, but I think it's so important and such a beautiful part of why I think they, why working with horses is attractive or can be attractive depending on who you are. Um, but let's say you are attracted, but you don't know anything. What about annual costs? Like, so I mean, you say
Okay.
if you're buying like a draft horse that's broken and trained, $5,000, that sounds like a lot, but it also sounds less than a
Yeah.
new tractor for sure. Um,
Definitely.
and but then like, what are the annual costs? So does it come out even? Like, I mean, is that even a fair comparison to think about like the life of a tractor versus the life of a horse or multiple horses? I've heard.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
I've heard from some people like anywhere between 5 and 6 thousand a year is a realistic cost for a horse. But what do you find like? But that might just
okay,
be,
our
yeah.
expenses are much less than that,
Oh,
thankfully.
fantastic. Okay.
Yeah, which is, and it may be different depending on where you're at and what kind of
Oh,
access to various inputs that you deem
right.
necessary
How
in
much you're
managing that
pampering them.
horse, right? So
Right.
with Buster, our annual expenses for him roughly $2,000 a year, maybe a little more. I would
Wow.
say that just over half of that are feed. So that could be
Right.
hay, because we don't currently make our own hay. Although Elise and I have made hay professionally. In order to make hay, it involves a lot of specialized equipment,
Yep.
and that is currently an expense that is beyond us. But because we live in this rural farming community where there's a lot of diversity in the farming, we do have a lot of resources for high quality local hay, and so we're happy to support a small local farmer with that expense. And so hay is most of what that annual $2,000 um, expenses entail. And then there's maybe like some dietary supplements, because let's remember that a draft horse, it's a working horse. And so you have to look at this animal similar to a professional athlete. And so care, quality of care, particularly quality of diet, is really, really important. So there are certain dietary supplements that we will give Buster throughout the season, depending on the time of year and the work that he's doing. And examples of that will be like flaxseed oil. He has a little,
Yeah.
when he comes into the barn in the morning and we put him in the stall, and that's just part of his routine. That way, if we need him for the day, he's right there and he's accessible. We don't have to go out into the pasture and chase him down. So getting him used to coming into the barn in the morning, he has his little breakfast. It may be a little bit of um, some mineral, a little bit of alfalfa pellets. There's a little bit of flaxseed oil in there. Depending on the year, we may toss in a little bit of oats or something along those lines. Maybe some beets or some carrots that we've grown. Maybe some apples that we've foraged off the farm. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
But some of those dietary supplements do factor into the feed expense. But that rest of the expenses, it's just things for his well-being. So it's the farrier, because
Uh-huh.
Elise and I do not have the skills to be able to maintain his hooves as best as we would like. Now, don't get me wrong, we can get in there and do very amateur kind
Yeah.
of farrier work, but we are not as skilled in that sense as we would like to be. But we're very thankful that there is a team of sisters that live maybe a 10-minute drive from here. And we love empowering local professionals, female professionals, young professionals. And these women encompass all of those things. And they do an amazing job maintaining Buster's feet. Now, working Buster does help to manage his hooves, but that farrier care does make a big difference. Buster
And
gets an
how
annual visit.
often?
Okay, so we generally do about 4 visits a year. I think we're going to start moving to 6 visits from the farrier a year.
Okay.
Suffolk punches, as the breed is known, they have particularly firm hooves. And so
Okay.
that can make it really challenging on a farrier. So the last time Maggie was here, she had requested that we do Buster 6 times a year instead of 4, because it's just a little less work for her, although she has to show up more often. Now, we're
Right.
very fortunate that Maggie and her sister Bailey, these ladies love to eat a dish of pasta. And in this household, that is a regular part of our dietary routine. So we like to joke that Maggie just wants to show up an extra 2 times because she wants pasta an extra 2 times a year. But, if the ladies are happy and Buster's happy and Elise and I are also content, then this relationship's going to work out just fine for all of us. But
That's great.
generally speaking, 4 times a year, depending on your horse, that can be sufficient enough. So the farrier expenses are part of that $2,000 total. Buster also gets an annual visit from the equine dentist because horses, their teeth grow for the entirety of their life. And if you
Mm,
don't maintain their teeth, it can mean it's very difficult for them to eat. And if they can't eat properly, they can't, so if they can't chew properly, they can't digest properly. If they can't digest properly, they can't get the nutrition that they need. It may also make them more prone to colic, which is not a good thing. So
right.
the annual visit from the equine dentist is certainly part of those expenses. And then we do have an annual veterinary visit from our local vet just to be sure that everything is on the up and up. But those generally tend to be uh, the lesser half of the expenses. Most of it is just about feed. But we do make a real concerted effort to give Buster the best food possible. Elise and I, we cook 3 meals a day, every day for ourselves because we do so much of this farm work, either by human power or by horsepower. We have to be sure that we fuel ourselves with really good quality food, and that is extended to Buster as well. And if the cats could respond to you, or if the chickens could respond to you, they'd tell you the same thing, that we make an effort to be sure that all of us eat the best that we possibly can. And I'm sure we could do a better job, but unfortunately, finances don't necessarily allow us to explore that to the degree that maybe we would like to. But with the resources we have available, we make sure that everybody is well fed, because we know if people are well fed, they'll be happy. If they're happy, they can be confident. If they're confident, they can perform. And we need performance out of these two-legged and four-legged farmers.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. No, it's not, I mean, the diet and care that you can give seems like it's the best medicine as well. That's the preventative thing, so that all those other bills are kept at a minimum. Because if you're eating
Correct.
well, the dentist is superfluous, and the doctor is the vet is superfluous. I mean, for all life, us and of horses, of course. Um, well, any other things that people should think about in terms of working with? Well, I think the big question is, like, why would, in what way does Buster integrate into the growing grapes? Like, how is he helpful? How do you use him? How, is it worth it for a grape farmer to have a Buster? um and yeah, like, what would you say in terms of that? Like, just because you love horses, like, is it worthwhile if you're just growing 7 acres of grapes? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it really depends. What do you need mechanization for? Because as silly as it sounds, oxen and horses were some of the first mechanization on the farm before the
Yeah.
invention of the tractor. Right? And if you look
Yeah.
at historical documents, they actually describe farming with horses as mechanization. So, what
Yeah.
are you using these animals for? And we'll creep into more of this as we discuss our farming practices, but we don't mow, we don't till. Now, we will let Buster walk through the vineyards in the spring to do some spring mowing, if you want to call it that.
Uh-huh.
We do use Buster to move heavy loads around the farm.
Yep.
So, say for example, in the wintertime, we do a little bit of logging here on this farm. Buster will be skidding logs in the wintertime.
Right.
We actually use Buster as part of our spray program. So, one thing we did not discuss is equipment.
Right.
And so, equipment for farming with horses, you can now find some equipment available in the United States. We have a relationship with a gentleman in France whose company makes implements for viticulture that are both horse driven and tractor driven. But most of them are kind of tillage tools. So that wasn't really useful to us because we don't till on our farm. We never have,
Right.
and hopefully never will. But finding a horse-drawn sprayer can sometimes be a challenge. There are some older designs that are out there. A lot of the stuff that is more of a modern design, they're generally intended for Amish farms, and so not necessarily designed for viticulture. And so, what we had to do on that end is because we have relationships in the Amish community, we went to a gentleman that we know who's Amish, who owns a metal fabrication shop, and he has a very engineering brain. And so we presented him a design. And so working with him and with our input, and then our horse mentor, Dwayne, because Dwayne has some just incredibly valuable input in so many regards, but definitely when it comes to farming with horses, the three of us were able to put together a design that we felt would work for our farming operations. So Buster actually helped with the spraying of the vines as well. And so we're trying to give Buster as many tasks as possible. Again, not trying to give him work just for work's sake, but trying to give him work that we feel would already need to be done anyway. And if this has to be done on a slightly larger scale, rather than us walk through the vineyards with backpacks, and we do have backpack sprayers because there are certain instances where that may be more appropriate, but certainly hooking Buster up to that horse-drawn sprayer and having him walk through the vineyards and carry that load, he is far better suited to it than Elise and I are carrying those backpacks mile after mile.
So great. Okay. So spraying, he attaching equipment to him so he can pull things through the vineyard. I'm sure anything like that, even though you're not tilling, like if you want to pull, I don't know if you are pulling like your prunings out of the vineyard, but he could, follow behind with a wagon.
He could, yeah.
And yeah, pull those out.
Anything you can do with a tractor, you can do with a horse, with the exception of, at least to my knowledge, I have yet to see a bucket attachment or a fork attachment for a horse. And I'm sure somebody has designed it. I haven't seen it yet. But anything that a tractor can pull, you can find the means of doing the exact same job with a horse.
Great. What kind of
do you feel like we've exhausted the Go ahead.
No, I mean, I guess I was just about to shift it, but like I should say before shifting to where this goes next. But is there anything else that we should mention about this for anybody who we're doing I mean, seems like a pretty comprehensive job of really talking about some of the things that I don't hear people talk about. Anytime you hear people work with horses, like I just haven't heard the detail of this kind, but I think it's great because I think I mentioned to you, like I think it is an amazing thought experiment, but I think more and more it shouldn't just be a thought experiment but to consider how to design our agricultural systems in the absence of fossil fuels. Like how do we I mean we've done it once, that was how agriculture was done, but we also have, a lot. We've perhaps gained some different knowledge. We've perhaps, have some new ecological understanding, and we perhaps are approaching things a little differently than, the first people who came and just cleared the land and tilled it with horsepower. And so, reapproaching it now with from a different perspective, but with the same limitations, which might not be limitations, but opportunities to revitalize, our air and water and, everything else and earth by redesigning without fossil fuels as part of the necessary ingredient for operation. Are we missing anything else though? Like, is there any?
I feel like this is a topic that you could spend an entire podcast discussing solely this.
Right.
And
so good.
There's probably little things I'm sure there's little things we left out here and there. One of the great things about Buster as a tractor is he produces fertilizer. I've yet to see any of these modern tractors produce a fertilizer that I can use in other capacities on the farm. That's another added benefit of farming with animals it's not this that you have this relationship with something, or that you can work together to get these various tasks done. There are other components of this relationship that are beneficial. And to your point, these are things that people have done for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It, in many ways, is appropriate for us to revisit some of these things because there wasn't anything wrong with them. Times just changed. But with that change and that farming for efficiency, it has come with other challenges, which we are now recognizing. And so, not that we should go back to farming with horses for nostalgia's sake, right? Because we love the stories from grandma and grandpa. No, you should farm with a horse because you love working with horses and because you feel as if it's the best technology available for your farm. And
Yeah.
that's what Elise and my understanding was. And if we didn't love farming with horses, or if we felt like it was not the best technology, Buster wouldn't be here. But because we felt so strongly, we felt like it was a good fit, and so far that's proven to be the case. And yeah, much like everything else we do on this farm, we'll revisit it in 5 to 10 years and let you know how it's going.
Yeah, that's great. Well, so considering that you have this ecosystem that includes Buster and you have this diversity of grapes growing, what does your
Mm-hmm.
wine look like? Like, are you making a bunch of different kinds of wine? Are you making one giant field blend? What's your,
Bravo. So this is very good for you. Good for you. You, as always, Adam, you have an insight that is so valuable. So I said earlier we have these three foundations to our farming, and horsepower being one of them. And then we, discussed Buster ad nauseum. But we have these two other foundations to our farming, and one is biodiversity.
Mm,
And you had touched upon it. We have all these things going on here. And it's not just the number of varieties we are growing, it's also and on occasion, we do use cover crops or companion plants that we introduce ourselves. But for the most part, we really prefer not to discourage native plants that are already successful on our farm. And I'll give
sure.
you an example of that. Autumn olive, for example. Autumn
Yeah.
olive, many people consider to be invasive. We think that it's a fabulous companion plant for many reasons, whether
Mm,
it's the nitrogen fixation, it produces a human and animal friendly crop. You
mm-hmm.
don't need a lot of inputs for healthy and consistent growth.
Yeah.
It's prune tolerant, so it's ideal for a chop and drop technique.
Yeah.
It can be kept to a manageable size. It can act as a shrub layer for those who are into mimicking plant hierarchies and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Uh, so maintaining these biodiverse vineyards, and of course the grapes are the commercial component that we focus most on, but everything has a role to play in these ecosystems.
Yeah.
And before I get too deep into the design of the vineyards, which I think you'll find interesting, I'll touch on the last foundation of our farming philosophy, which is indigenous microbiology. So our
Okay.
spray program is defined by the use of indigenous microbiology because in our opinion, nothing is more affordable, accessible, or most importantly, effective. And so, what we found is that by harvesting rainwater off the roofs of the outbuildings and then using indigenous microbiology, those things encompass about 98% of what we spray on the vines. The
Yeah.
remaining 2% tends to be some kind of anaerobic ferment or some kind of tea that we made from ingredients sourced off the farm. We'll generally incorporate a very small percentage of some kind of oil. It's usually like a seed oil, like a flax seed or something along those lines. And then we will use some kind of OMRI approved wetting agent as well in the spraying of the vines. And then we will occasionally use some other inputs such as local hay, local wood chips, manure, whether it's from Buster or the chickens, that sort of thing. But
Yeah.
we do find that the indigenous microbiology, the plants absolutely love it. And it's something that you can, and we're not necessarily into immediate gratification on this farm, but my goodness, by using indigenous microbiology, spraying in the morning or spraying in the evening, and then returning, an hour later and looking at those plants, like the proof is really right there in front of your eyes. And I could not encourage other people enough to explore using your own indigenous microbiology. Whether you're a small farmer or a large farmer, whether you're farming grapes or something else, there is a real potency in utilizing indigenous microbiology that I can't speak highly enough about.
Yeah. That's great.
All right,
So,
so now you asked specifically about like the viticultural specifics.
well,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that system. What is that design and the viticultural specifics that you're
sure.
working with?
So we have 7 acres under vine. these 7 acres are divided into 5 different parcels that are situated throughout the entirety of our property. The property in itself is about 70 acres. And so rather than have one monolithic block of grapevines, right, and have this section be dedicated to this variety and this section be dedicated to this variety, we have 7 acres under vine split amongst 5 different parcels that are spread out throughout the entirety of the property. So they're separated by natural, unmanaged growth.
Right.
Okay. Each vineyard is named after a different family member. Right? And
Okay.
part of the reason is because I used to work in a vineyard and that I eventually came back to and managed later. And as much as I love vineyard work, like with a lot of farm jobs, the work can get repetitive. And at some point, as much as I love being in the vineyard, if I have to go out and spend one more day shoot thinning the Pinot Grigio, right? I'm ready for that job to be done and to move on to the next task. So
Right.
you and I had mentioned this earlier before we started recording is branding, how you talk about something. And so
Yeah.
what we realized is that by naming the vineyard after a different family member, rather than going out into a certain vineyard to perform a task which may or may not be wearing on me, instead I get to go spend the day with Franca, who's my aunt in Italy. Or I get to
Right.
go spend the day with Grandma Fern, which is Elise's grandmother, who we had a very close relationship with until she passed away. So simply by branding those vineyards differently makes a big difference in the relationship you have with them. Now
Yeah,
that
that's
might just be distinct to us, but I can swear by it does make a difference. Now, all of these vineyards are planted, bar one, multivarietal. Okay, so we only
right.
have one of these parcels that is monovarietal. Everything else is planted to numerous varieties. All of the vineyards are planted to a stake.
Okay.
Okay, so most of those vines are planted to a vertical cordon, which you will be familiar with because you're out in California. And we really like vertical cordon for the North American hybrids and for native varieties.
This is
We
something that
have,
I like if we can describe this a little bit. This is
mhm,
sort of like it's almost like a Christmas tree growth, right? Like you're
mhm,
allowing the growth areas. It's not like goblet, which most people think of when they think of like a head train system.
correct.
This is you have a whole, it's like a Christmas tree. Like it literally goes up and the growth areas shoot out from different areas as you go up the how high up do you go with the
Yeah,
cordon?
so to give people a kind of a visual here, most of the stakes on our farm are 5 or 6 feet above ground. So we will create a trunk that will grow up the entirety of that stake. And then from about 18 inches from the ground all the way up to the top of that stake, you will have arm positions where then that vine is putting out vegetative growth that then support clusters.
And so those become the spurs when you prune back each year. So it's sort of like,
Correct.
yeah, got it. Okay, cool.
Correct.
Yeah,
And we find
lovely.
that we really like that system.
What do you like about
Again, there's
that?
not. So first and foremost, what we like about planting to a stake is we like the openness of
Yeah,
it. And so when farming with a horse, something we did not touch upon is a horse like a tractor. It's a dangerous piece of equipment,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
so but unlike a tractor, right? Because a tractor, something gets squirrely, you can shut that tractor off, you can jump off it, right? A
right,
horse doesn't necessarily allow you those accommodations. So we have seen here in West Michigan when people have a deer that gets caught up in their trellising wire, and that is a ugly situation. So the
right,
last thing we would want is Buster getting caught up in trellising wires. And so we like the open feel of not
right,
having the constraints of a post and wire system. We
right.
also like it because we look at a lot of historical documentation when it comes to not just viticulture, but also enology. Because in many ways, what we're doing here more closely resembles how people used to grow grapes and make wine than what people are doing today. And we still pay attention to what's coming out in a contemporary sense, but we really like referencing some of this older information that's still available. And if you look at writings from viticulturalists during the time period where vineyards were both planted to a stake and to a post and wire system, almost there's a unanimous agreement that for wine grapes and subsequently quality, planting vines to a stake is the way to go. Now, it's not necessarily vertical cordon or head trained. There are many other ways that you can trellis grapevines to a stake, but so many of the guys writing about viticulture maintained that for wine grapes and for quality, planting a vine to a stake is the way to go. And they would say planting your table grapes or your juice and jelly grapes, whatever it may be, to a post and wire system was better for those varieties. Now, they probably knew something we didn't, but we felt like it was something that we were willing to explore, mostly because if you look at some of the information that is out there in a contemporary sense, there is a lot to be said for how we trellis and how we prune grapevines. And I have read some information that has suggested that when you are pruning and trellising your grapevines in a way that is more respective of their natural growth habits, you can extend the life of that grapevine by 25 years, 50 years. Some people say twice the age that you would normally get. And so I know in particular vertical cordon and head trained, what you referred to as gobelets, what we call here on the farm albarello, because we do have a vineyard that's trained to PV grapes and then interplanted our vinifera. And I don't think vinifera for our climate are great for that vertical cordon because
Okay.
we can occasionally experience some colder winters and then we would get some dieback and then we'd have to rebuild, certain parts of that vine structure. But
Right.
having some lower head trained structures for some of those more cold tender varieties makes a little more sense.
Right.
But we do find that, yeah, that head trained and vertical cordon tend to be a little more respectful for how these vines want to grow. And there are other reasons why we employ them as well, but I think those are maybe the strongest that I can articulate off the top of my head. Now,
Okay.
we do have one other vineyard, which I really hope that when you come to visit, we can not just look at, but actually get inside of to experience. Is we have an interpretation on the vite maritata or the married vines.
Awesome.
And that is in Michigan. And I don't know if this is distinct to West Michigan or to the entire state, but at a certain point in time, various extension offices suggested that farms plant Christmas trees. And there are still plenty of Christmas tree farms here in Michigan, and some
Yep.
do a
Yep.
relatively successful job. But I've also seen a lot of older farms with these parcels of Christmas trees that were put in that were never harvested, probably because it never became economically viable to do so. It was one of those things where it's like, hey, you got this spot on your site that you're not having a lot of success with. Put some Christmas trees there. Eventually it'll
Right.
become profitable. Well,
Right.
those pine stands still exist. So they obviously never became profitable. And some of them are starting to come to the end of their lifetime. And so they're starting to be overtaken by deciduous trees that are coming into those ecosystems. And so we took one of those parcels on our property, which wasn't a favorable, what we thought a favorable location for viticulture, and we topped some of the trees and then inserted stakes into the trunk to act as branches. And we have vines growing up those trunks and out onto those stakes. And I'm glad that we didn't do all 7 acres trellised to that method. But I tell you what, I am so glad that we decided to plant that vineyard that way because that specific vineyard has been the healthiest. It's been the most disease resistant. It's been the most vigorous. It's been the first to fruit. And this has been really encouraging in that it can pay to explore concepts outside of the boundaries that we've either created for ourselves in our own heads or maybe the industry has created for us. As you know, the wine industry in the state of Michigan is so young. And even in the United States, it's relatively young compared to other parts of the world. We don't have an 8,000-year legacy of growing grapes and making wine like in some places. So have we really figured everything out, right? Particularly as things change in a climactic sense, is really, some whether it's some form of VSP or high wire cordon, is this really the best way of growing grapevines? Still to this day, if there was an ideal way of trellising grapes, everybody would be doing it. And because you see so many different interpretations, suggests that there is no perfect way of doing it. You just have to find something that works for you and you can live with and push on with it. But we have found with this particular vineyard that it has completely decimated any expectation we could have had for it in the most positive of ways. And don't get me wrong, 5 years from now, I could tell you, hey, Adam, remember that thing we talked about 5 years ago that I was so high on? Well, that was a failure. But I can tell you up to this point, every year, it's only been increasingly more suggestive that this was a good idea, and that going forward, if we were going to establish more acreage, that we would look into exploring an alternative form of trellising because of this success.
Let me ask you a couple questions.
Sure.
How close to the trunk did you plant the vines? Is it like outside the where the branches, like the sort of the ring of where the branches fall out? Yeah, I mean, if you can describe the
No,
actual. Okay.
no. So within this system, because it was so new, we have instances where we have one vine at the base of the trunk, and maybe the closest they'll be is 6 inches from the trunk. Furthest
Okay.
away, maybe a foot at
Okay.
most.
Right.
But
Gotcha.
we've experimented with two vines around a trunk. We've experimented with three. We've experimented with four and even five, depending on the location within the vineyard, the size and the robustness of the trunk. How sturdy we thought it was going to be, so on and so forth. Because we don't know what is the optimal distance to
And
plant from the trunk, or what is the optimal amount of vines to have around, to collaborate around the base of the trunk. So
and are
it
these?
made sense for us to experiment.
Yeah, of course. So these are all evergreen trees?
Correct.
Okay. And are you removing branches? I mean, you topped them. Are you removing branches? You're literally
So
next to a
so look at
mature evergreen or semi-mature
yes.
evergreen, like
So
right.
look at it this way. There is, because these pine stands were mature, a lot of that growth towards the bottom part of the tree that has long been shaded out,
Right.
right? So those branches long gone. So
Right.
when it came to topping trees, you were removing most of that vegetative growth, the pine needles themselves. Anything else that we were taking off were branches that at this point were old. They had died back. You could pull most of them off with your hands. You didn't need a chainsaw to remove them. And
Okay.
so we did leave a number of trees intact within this particular vineyard for a number of reasons. We really appreciate a lot of the diversity on this farm, not just plant life, but also animal life. And so, yeah, we've got Buster the horse, and we've got, the farm cats, and we've got the chickens. And we would love to grow the farm family in that sense, but we have so much diversity of wildlife on this farm, including bird activity. And so we noticed when working in that vineyard, because none of the decisions we've made on this farm have been overnight, right? We don't want to go in and just clear cut and then establish a vineyard. We want to observe what's going on there and
Yeah.
maybe remove a tree, maybe remove another one over time, evaluate how this impacts that ecosystem, that mesoclimate. And
Yeah.
so we saw that in that particular system, there were a lot of chickadees, which are probably my favorite kind of bird. There were a lot of blue jays, which I also love. We had some really great horned owl activity, because I don't know if there's any other
Yeah.
activity that a great horned owl can do other than a great activity. They are such a wonderful, haunting, and we talked about this earlier,
Yeah.
magical
Yeah.
animal.
Yeah.
And I just recently, before winter truly set in here on the farm, as a quick story, we were getting some heavy rain. This was probably sometime early mid December. And I was out on the back side of the farm, and I was walking back up to the house because we were getting a heavy rainfall, and there were these big droplets of water, and it was quite loud. And I was walking past this vineyard that we've been discussing, what we affectionately refer to as Zorzo. And so I'm walking past this Zorzo vineyard, and all of a sudden, out the corner of my eye, I see this big thing, woof, take off. And couldn't tell what it was immediately, but it must have been surprised by me because it hit one of the pine trees that we had left intact, and it nosedived for the back corner of this vineyard, which we leave very unmanaged. So there's a lot of vegetative growth. And I just saw this rustling amongst this growth. And then all of a sudden, this great horned owl pops up because we have some fencing to keep the deer out of this particular parcel. This great horned owl shoots up this fence line and is about maybe 6 feet off the ground, just hanging onto the fence, staring at me. And this is probably the only time in my lifetime that I'll ever be able to experience this. But I was maybe 5 feet away from this great horned owl, and I'm about 6 feet tall. And so this
Wow.
thing is right at head height, and I'm looking at it, and it's looking at me. And it was such a peaceful and yet powerful and humbling and spiritual experience. Uh,
Yeah,
you
that
know, and I'm
sounds
glad that
awesome.
I could just experience that in a very natural way and not have my first reaction. And my first reaction was to lower my head in deference for the opportunity to experience something that most people will never experience. Where I would think most people nowadays, the first thing they would have done was pulled out their phone, taken a video, posted it to social media, and completely lost, right?
Yeah.
Some of the deeper meaning to, you know, what that relationship, even if very fleeting, could mean. And then I very quickly took a lap around the vineyard. And by the time I came back to that same spot, you know, that owl was gone. And funnily enough, you know, Elise and I had just mentioned, you know, it's been a while since we've heard the owls. I wonder where they're at and what they're doing. Well, they're still out there, and they're out there because we still left some trees intact. Because had we
Yeah.
gone through and topped all of those trees, they may have migrated to another part of the farm, but they would no longer have found that to be a suitable habitat. And you know, we don't want to discourage nature if we can prevent
Right.
that. You know,
Right.
when it comes to deer, you know, we do have some management on that level because, you know,
Well,
deer
let me
will
ask about that.
eat
So you
young
just
grapevines, they'll eat fruit.
yeah, yeah, let me ask about
Yep,
that. So you have 5 different, blocks or
correct.
individual vineyards. Did you have to put deer fencing around all 5 of those? How do you manage deer?
No.
So
So
how
what
do you
we do is the vineyards that are situated as close to our home as possible because we do live on the farm. Those vineyards that are very close to the house, we don't have deer fencing around.
Okay,
And we haven't really found a need to yet. And I would think once we incorporate a farm dog, that will do a better job of managing any concern that we would have with
right,
deer creeping into some of those more closer to home vineyards. Now, some of the vineyards that are further away from the house, and one particular that's on the back side of the property, yeah, that's one we definitely had to put deer fencing in because we saw on the back side of our property, just by observing, that is a deer superhighway, and they
okay,
are traveling because we have two relatively larger farms that are adjacent to us. And yeah, there's a lot of acreage, and they definitely like to make the backside of our farm a not just a passage for travel, but they certainly like to spend some time, whether it's a night or a week. They like to find very comfortable spots to sleep on the back end of the farm, which is fine for them. It's not great if you have a vineyard without deer fencing up. So that's why we put deer fencing up on that vineyard on the backside of the farm. But we find that there's other benefits to that phenomenon in that we have a friend who lives not too far from us, and he does survey work as his profession. And so we've done some trades with him where, you know, he may lay out a vineyard for us, and then he gets to, in exchange, he gets to hunt the property during hunting season, and that's an activity that he really enjoys doing with his two young children. And so he gets something out of it, we get something out of it. You know, we may occasionally get a little bit of venison as well, if that's, you know, part of how the relationship works that season. And there are ways that you can find ways of managing these predicaments where it's an opportunity, right? But
yeah,
if you're only
yeah,
looking at it as a drawback, then it's just this constant frustration. It's this constant fight. And I'd
right,
rather not look at my day to day as a struggle. I'd rather look at it as an opportunity to, well, what can we gain from this? And if we can't gain from it, can someone else gain from it? That, and then in turn, we might also benefit from it. And even if we don't benefit from it, the fact that someone else can get something out of it, in this case, you know, our friend Alex, where he gets this really wholesome activity that he gets to do with his children, and you know, it's something that he was past along hunting through his father, that was passed along through his father, and now he gets to pass it along to his kids. And yeah,
Yeah.
and they're essentially maybe 2 miles away from us, so they can hop in their little 4x4 and drive over here, and or hop in the truck and drive over. And it's yeah, why can't we establish some of these relationships in the communities that, although we might not necessarily benefit from, someone else can? And my goodness, it's like we're not taking advantage of it. Let someone else do it.
Let me ask you a couple more specifics about those trees. So are they,
Mhm.
do you, they're still living? Like, even though you've topped them, they continue to live. Is that right?
No. So
Okay.
generally with
Gotcha.
deciduous trees, yeah, you can top them and they can continue to live. Usually with coniferous trees, once you top them, that's pretty
That's
much a
it.
death sentence. But as I said, those trees were more or less on the way out anyway. And so it was
Gotcha.
a matter
Okay.
of just kind of expediting that natural process.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. That helps a lot. And then, what I'm just going to have to ask you to do is get us
Mhm.
some photos, and I will post some photos about this, because just to be able to visualize what you've done with it, I know, I
Sure.
mean, I know that there's many other people who probably have similar situations with the abandoned Christmas tree farms, and I mean, I think about it because, in like on the East Coast, one of the first like sort of pioneer succession in the forest succession, once like something is converting from meadow to first stage forest succession, it's going to be white
Mhm.
pines. You're going to see white pines in there,
Really
and yeah, so I mean, at least if you have
interesting.
white pines around at all, they are the fastest growing. They seed very easily. They get spread around pretty easily. So if you have any white pine on your property, if you have a cleared land that you just neglect for 5 years, you're going to have 6 foot tall white pines in there pretty easily. Like they'll be the first thing to pop up.
Yeah,
Um,
so we do have a lot of pine trees on the property. I'm not sure if you or your audience is aware, but Michigan, particularly Central West Michigan, we're at this point where there's a lot of diversity, not just agricultural biodiversity, but native biodiversity. And I believe the southern part of the state is more deciduous with trees, and the northern part of the state is more coniferous. But here in the middle part, particularly the west middle part of Michigan, we get the marriage of those two environments. And so, because of that, we get a lot of diversity. And I like, just for example, with the forage off this property alone, I mean, we get uh, apples and pears and pin cherries and blackcap raspberries and dewberries and blackberries and raspberries and gooseberries and ramps and all kinds of forageable, edible, medicinal herbs, and the list goes on and on and on. And part of that is because we have this circumstance of the proximity to the lake, the climate, the soils. We have the meeting of these two environments where one is more coniferous, one is more deciduous. And although we have a lot of white pines and a lot of pines that appear in general, what we find as the number one pioneer that suggests to us that these soils are transitioning into a more of a perennial or forested environment is the pin cherry. It's the first thing that comes
and
up.
cherry.
It's also the first thing to come down. So
Is
if you walk some of the more established woodlots on the farm, the mature pin cherries are always the first things to come down. And so that's oftentimes what we're going out
Interesting.
into the woods to harvest with Buster,
Gotcha.
because we like to leave some of that in. Obviously, we like to leave a lot of that into the woods to help feed that system, but we
Yeah.
also really like them because they're very quick to break down and they're a wonderful material to put into the vineyards, because we like returning a lot of wood to the vineyards, whether
Yeah.
it's wood chip mulch to do a deep mulch around the vines, or whether just to leave chunks of logs in between the vines to act as a resource for retaining water, nutrition, act as a
Sure.
habitat for beneficial microbes and insects. Yeah, we really appreciate that resource.
Yeah, I mean, biochar would be the other thing I would suggest, if you guys to add back into the vineyard as well. It's an incredible thing if you want to burn some of that biomass as well. Yeah, I
We
mean,
try to return as much carbon as possible to the system without lighting it on fire.
yeah,
And I
it's
know, and for us, I think the best way of returning carbon to a system is leaving root systems intact,
yeah,
because you're
yeah,
going to ultimately get far more carbon sequestration through leaving those root systems intact. And so that's part of why for the all of the vineyards, and so I said all the vineyards are planted to different varieties. All of the vineyards are named after a different family member. We manage all of the vineyards differently because of the varieties there and the specifics of that site, because we
yeah.
have a lot of mesoclimate variation on the farm. But in all of the vineyards, we've never tilled, not even when we established the vineyard, we've never tilled. We do not mow because we believe in allowing the entire ecosystem to go through as much of its natural cycle as possible without human interruption. And part of that means like leaving those roots intact because that is how you are going to build soil.
I'm I'm also really fascinated, you know, evergreen trees, especially, I'm going back to that one block. I mean, we could probably just talk
Mm-hmm.
about that one, a whole episode on that. But tend the needles tend to acidulate the soil. Have you had the soil tested to know like what the pH is under those trees where you're growing the vines? Like, what do you know what your soil is generally on the property? And
All right, so this is a good question. So first of all, we have never done a soil test for the farm because I can tell
amazing.
you just from looking out on the farm, I can tell you from looking out on the farm based upon what grows and what does not grow,
Okay.
more or less what the pH of the soil is. And I can tell you that our pH here, it's slightly on the acidic side. We do have to do soil testing for the winery
Yeah.
as part of our wastewater disposal plan. And from the testing we've done for that, our pH tends to be around like 6.4, 6.5.
Oh, that's really
So
nice.
not
Yeah.
right, so not particularly acidic, and quite respectable for grapevines, whether it be pure vinifera or North American hybrid or anything in between.
Wild. Yeah, that's
I know
fantastic.
what people say with the pine needles and the acidulation. We haven't found that to be an issue. I've also read some conflicting studies that suggest by the time that those pine needles start breaking down, that they're actually pH neutral. And so some of the needles that are fresher, younger, that are at the top of that mulch layer will be a little acidic. But again, by the time they start to get to soil level and start
Right.
interacting more with soil microbiology that's active at that level, then at that point, relatively pH neutral and not a huge concern. We have done some deep mulching with pine needles, haven't seen an issue with that impacting plant growth. We've
Nice.
done deep mulching with wood chips, whether it be hardwood, softwood, deciduous, coniferous, you name it. Have not seen any kind of issue. Generally speaking, with wood chips, if you are going to use them, we do recommend putting something in between the soil and the chips themselves, just
Yeah.
so that microbiology isn't tying up some of that nitrogen in an effort to break down in those early stages some of the wood chips. So either putting in some kind of compost or manure or some kind of green manure to interface with the wood
Yeah. Or
chips.
I mean,
Right?
another tip is like if you pile those wood chips for a while until they start to break
Correct.
down and get some fungal growth in them, and then spread them around, then you've got actually it's almost like you've inoculated them with the microbiology before
Yeah.
using
Oh,
them.
yeah. And again, that's a testament to nature and time, right? Give
Right.
your wood chips some time. And so, oftentimes, if we will get wood chips delivered to the farm, we let them sit for as long as possible. When we do make our indigenous microbiology, if we have any extra, that gets dumped right onto that wood chip pile. So we are
Right.
inoculating all of those
Yeah.
wood chips with our own indigenous microbiology. So by the time we are getting around to using them, yeah, hopefully they've broken down a little and are quite active with our own indigenous microbiology.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, you know what? I think that we should come up with a way to end this conversation now because
I
we
think you
could
just did.
we could go on, but I think there's more to say, and we'll have to do another one of these at some point. But I don't know. I mean, but like any closing words before just like a hard, and we're done.
Yeah,
Any
so I do want to make one thing clear about the management of the vineyards because I talked a lot about what we do not do. And then we briefly got into things that we do, which include deep mulching of vines, because
Right.
we prefer that to cultivation. One thing I
Yeah.
should mention that we do is every year, each vineyard gets an annual haircut. And that is our very friendly way of saying that these vineyards get an annual chop and drop. So we will walk through the vineyard, and if there happens to be something growing that makes the management of that vineyard challenging, so whether it's walking through and managing it as a human or walking through and participating in the management with Buster, for example, say we have a sapling that's growing up right in a row middle. Once a year, those vineyards get a single pass. It could happen in the spring, it could happen in the summer, it could happen in the fall after winemaking season is over. But we will make one pass through those vineyards. Everything will get chopped off at soil level that we deem challenging from a management point of view. And then that goes right back into feeding the system all over again. And we like it when things regrow because, young saplings that are an inch or two poking out of the ground don't really compromise the management of the vineyards very much. But once they get to be, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, that's another story. But
Yeah.
getting that biomass back into feeding the vineyard and acting as its own mulch layer. And then if that inspires that plant to regrow, all the better yet, because we'll come back the next year and a following year and return to that resource. Because why am I going to import all of these resources to manage my farm when I've got all of these resources right here? I just have to recognize that they are a resource and then put in the time to utilize them.
Do you mow at all?
No, we do not mow at all.
So,
We experimented with mowing in the very beginning, and it was only in really one vineyard, and it was kind of every other row. And we found it to be, I don't want to say unnecessary, but I don't think it was essential for us to do that. And so once we stopped doing that, we didn't see a huge detriment from that decision. And so that was only in the very beginning in one vineyard. And ever since then, yeah, we just stopped mowing and we're content with that decision. It's a lot less work.
and so do you do any ground cover management in terms of like, obviously you don't have like a sheep flock yet, but I mean, you otherwise just let them grow to their natural height throughout the growing season, whatever is growing
We
on the ground.
let we believe that although the grapes for us commercially are the most important part of those ecosystems, everything that is in that ecosystem is important and they should all be entitled to the opportunity to go through their full life cycle, and because we like things to reseed, right? And
Right.
we have such a diverse range of plants in
Right.
these vineyards depending on where they're located. And it might drive somebody else crazy, but we love that we have all of this beautiful native growth coming up. And the only way that we maintain that is by leaving it to its own designs, right? So it can reseed, right? And if that system starts to change, then those plants will follow suit. That's inevitable, but we want to not be at the wheel. We want those plants to be able to make those decisions accordingly. We're looking after the grapevines, everything else can look after itself. And if we find that something is particularly problematic, we may have a conversation about that and maybe discuss ways of managing it. But thankfully, up to this point, we have not been confronted with a situation where we have had to manage any one particular plant in a heavy handed way because we thought that it was either compromising our management or it was, less than an ideal companion for the grapevines. So far, everything has played pretty nice together, and hopefully that continues. Now, I don't want to sit here and suggest that we don't have our own challenges, and sometimes, in all honesty, the biggest challenge is the one between your own ears. So that's always that conversation. Like, what is a weed? Well, what is a weed? Everyone's
Right.
definition of a weed is different. One man's weed is another man's cover crop. And so we have found that not by defining these plants as, well, do we want this here? Do we not want this here? Is it really compromising things at the end of the day is kind of our question. And if it's not, then it can stay. And if it gets to a point where, as I said, we need to have a conversation about it, we will. we're realistic. This is a business at the end of the day. And so we do have certain financial demands that ultimately will need to be met. But until we come to that point, we're not going to manage these systems in a way that in any way prevents all of these other plants that have just as much of a right to be there as anything else, than denying them that opportunity to go through life the way that Mother Nature intended.
Mimmo, thank you so much for this conversation. This was great.
Adam, it couldn't happen without you, my friend. Thank you.
We'll do this again, and we'll just stop right now, but this is fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I want to thank all of you who support this podcast through donations, Patreon subscriptions, sponsorships, or just posting a great review and telling a friend. You make this podcast possible, and I'm honored and humbled and inspired by your support. If you'd like to support this podcast, you'll find links to all the ways you can support it in the show notes.